In 1961, President Kennedy called on all Americans to rise to the challenges of the day. He knew that success depended upon the unity of efforts throughout the federal government and the nation. The Greater Boston Federal Executive Board, one of 28 across the country, fosters communication, coordination, and collaboration with federal, state, and local government agencies. This is your federal government, and I am your host, Diane LeBlanc. Hello, everyone. Today we are featuring the Department of Housing and Urban Development. With us today is Barbara Fields, who is the Regional Administrator for the New England area. Regional Administrator Fields is accompanied by several members of her team: Charlie Francis from the Office of Public and Indian Housing, Lauren Wilhoit from the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and Stephanie Harrington representing the Office of Community Planning and Development. Welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Regional Administrator Fields, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
How long have you been with the Department of Housing and Urban Development?
Just last week I celebrated 3 years.
Excellent, excellent. Can you give our viewers just a brief overview of the history of the agency, and then tell us what the primary mission of HUD is?
Well, HUD's primary mission is to create strong, inclusive communities and to provide affordable housing for all citizens. So we were formed out of the Housing Act in '37 and became a cabinet level position in the early 60s. Okay. So we've been around now just over 50 years.
All right. And your geographic area of responsibility is New England?
Yes, we cover the 6 states of New England: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut.
You passed the geography test.
Yes. It's been fun. It's a great region.
It is a great region. Now, in terms of your staff, are they based in Boston? Do you have staff throughout the region? What's your structure look like?
Okay. So HUD has 10 regions, and we have one office in each state in New England. So we have 270 employees here in New England, and about 170 of those are in our Boston office. That's our largest office. And then we have an office in Bangor, one in Manchester, one in Burlington, Hartford, and Providence.
And in terms of the 10 regions, how does Boston compare size-wise?
We're a medium-sized region as far as population, probably a small one geographically. Obviously, my colleague who covers Alaska, Washington, Oregon has a bigger geography, but we have a lot of people here in New England. And we also have a lot of housing partners that we work with and some of the oldest housing stock in the country.
How about in terms of the funding that is distributed? How much funding from HUD goes into the New England communities?
Well, in the last fiscal year, we invested about $15 billion in the region. So HUD is not only investing in housing, but creating jobs when we make those investments.
That's a huge investment. Now, in terms of that, how much of that is Massachusetts?
Massachusetts, I believe, is probably just over half of that amount because we have the largest population of the
Wow.
states in the region.
Okay. So you gave us the mission statement.
Right.
And that's a huge charge. What are your major programs that just sort of you run here throughout the region that help you fulfill that mission?
So HUD has what we call the Big Four, and we have representatives here today from those different areas. So the first area is public and Indian housing that is providing public housing and affordable housing for residents. And then Stephanie's with community planning and development, which is investing in community block grants and dealing with homeless issues and creating long-term permanent solutions. Then we have fair housing, which Lauren is here for, which deals with the fact that we have laws in this country that protect people from discrimination in their attempts to get housing. She can talk a little bit about that. And then our largest division is called our housing division, and within that there are 4 different areas. But mostly that is the area that deals with single family homes, and the insurance that we provide, mortgage insurance, and then multifamily, so apartment buildings, or here in New England, obviously dealing with three family homes, which we know a lot about in this region.
Excellent, so good. So those are the big four. We'll talk a little bit about maybe each of them, and you can handle the last. All right. So Charlie, you have public and Indian housing.
Yes.
Define public housing. What is it?
So public housing, it's one of HUD's oldest programs. Actually, it might be HUD's oldest program, created under the Housing Act of 1937. And what's interesting about this program is that HUD is not literally providing the housing, but we provide funding and regulatory oversight to housing authorities in most cities and towns across the region. And a housing authority is basically a unit of local government who actually runs the program under our oversight.
Okay. So in terms of those programs, many people are sort of familiar with the Section 8 terminology. Mm-hmm. Where does Section 8 fit in?
So the difference between Section 8 and public housing is more of a tradition, the housing is actually owned by the housing authority and under specific restrictions from HUD. Whereas Section 8, it's still run through a housing authority, but you get a voucher that you can use on the private market to go secure housing of your choice. And so that public housing's been around since the 30s, whereas the Section 8 program really was created in the 70s. It used to be called the certificate program. So it still helps pay your rent, but you have a greater variety of choice of where you can live.
Okay, so the primary goals of each of those programs, how do they differ?
So the goals of both programs is to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing, and that's actually in the 1937 Housing Act. But I would say the Section 8 program just has an additional goal of being able to provide low-income folks a greater choice of where they can live.
Okay, so on the public housing side of it, where HUD provides the money, is it to states, is it to local communities?
So we give it to the housing authorities, which is, they're part of the local community. Say if you live in Boston, all of the public housing programs are run through the Boston Housing Authority. They're affiliated with the city, but not necessarily a department of the city. It's a quasi-governmental organization. And so we fund them directly, and they provide the service, they provide the housing, and we're in more of an oversight role.
Who is eligible to receive assistance through these different programs?
So it differs a bit with public housing in Section 8. Under public housing, generally you're eligible if you're under 80% of what we call the area median income. And that's basically HUD determines each year for cities and towns, how much the average family makes for each household size, 1 member, 2 member, and so forth. So if you're under 80% of that, that's kind of the first eligibility test. But many housing authorities also do additional targeting, to even lower income folks. So there's really a lot of discretion at the local level. And with Section 8, it's similar, but the general limit is 50% of area median income, so it's a somewhat lower limit. But there's many exceptions to that. Some higher income folks could come in if you're elderly or disabled, if you're getting displaced from other federal housing. There's really a lot of exceptions.
So once it's determined that you are eligible, how is your rent determined?
So you generally pay 30% of your income after a series of deductions. And again, there's a long list of potential deductions. Some examples would be unreimbursed medical expenses, dependent care deductions, a lot of other things. But the rule is generally 30% of your income.
Okay. And if somebody is interested in applying, what's the process?
So either for public housing or Section 8, you don't go to HUD. We can provide information about how to get in touch with your local housing authority on our website or by contacting our office, but you actually make your application at the local housing authority. But for the Section 8 program, there's an additional wrinkle. About 80 or 90 housing authorities in Massachusetts, we have over 200, but about 80 or 90 participate in what's called the centralized waiting list. So that's maintained by an organization called Mass Narrow. And if you make an application at one participating housing authority, you're automatically on the statewide list. So if a vacancy comes up somewhere else, they're going to give you a call. It still might take a while, but we have nearly half of our housing authorities doing that sort of information sharing.
So is that optional for communities to
It is.
participate
They
in
can
that?
choose whether to participate in it or not.
Okay.
Many smaller housing authorities participate. Many find it's easier just administratively,
Mm-hmm.
and it's great for people who are applying.
Okay, interesting. Now, I think you made reference to this. There can be sort of situations, preferences
Mhm.
given. Can you talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about that and who might qualify to maybe not have as long of a wait?
Yeah, so again, that varies on the local housing authority level. HUD
Okay.
doesn't have absolute preferences. But in general, if you're a veteran, many housing authorities can have a veteran's preference. Many housing authorities have preferences for if you're a resident of their local community. So even if you're on this centralized waiting list, say you applied in Haverhill, if you're a Haverhill resident, you're going to come up likely sooner on Haverhill's waiting list than in other places.
So that's sort of what was going through my mind. It could get complicated because people are waiting. The reality is for housing all over the Commonwealth and in many communities. So there is a local preference where there can be a local preference.
Yeah, most places do have a local preference, veterans preference. A big part of not only HUD's mission, but the mission of many housing authorities is to help the homeless. So many housing authorities are starting to establish a homeless preference. Those are just a few examples. Victims of domestic violence also have under the Violence Against Women Act, have
Those
a
would
preference.
would constitute certainly very legitimate emergencies to
Yes.
get somebody into a different housing circumstances.
Yes.
Yes, definitely understood. Now, in terms of the Section 8 vouchers, does a community get an allotment of vouchers? Talk a little bit more about that program.
They do. So each housing authority does have an allotment of vouchers that they get from HUD. And that number is fixed. So generally, say one town gets 150 Section 8 vouchers from HUD. It's their job to manage their leasing within those numbers. People come on and off of the program. These days, people don't come off of the program very frequently because it's in high demand. But they have to just make sure they're staying within their budget because they get a certain amount of money from HUD each year. And they also have a certain amount of vouchers that they get each year, so they have to make sure that they can't lease 151 because they only have 150. Right. Usually, with housing costs, what they are in Massachusetts, the first is more of an issue. They'll usually reach their maximum budget authority before they reach their maximum number of vouchers that they can lease.
Now, in terms of that program and sort of those caps that you've just articulated, have those caps been in place for how long? How long has it been since that program has been expanded?
So the Section 8 program itself has been around since, in one form or another, since the 70s. I believe those caps were added at some point in the 90s. I'm not sure which piece of legislation, but I know it's statutory that you can't go above the number of vouchers that HUD has given you. I believe that was in the late 90s that was established. And in terms of budgetary caps, that's just sort of a common sense matter. You can't spend more than you have.
Excellent.
One of the areas where the caps have been raised in the last year's budget was in order to try and serve the homeless. So I think we have made it a priority in this administration to try and move the dial, so to speak, in that area. So we've given some additional budget authority there.
Yeah,
Good.
On that note, we do have a special, some of our Section 8 voucher programs serve special populations, and one of those is the HUD VASH program, Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing, and that's targeted towards homeless veterans. HUD and VA have had a goal for a number of years now to completely eliminate veterans' homelessness. So
And is that under your purview?
it is, yeah.
Okay.
Again, it's it's run by day to day by the housing authorities, but we have several housing authorities in Massachusetts and in New England that run that program.
And Charlie, how long have you been with HUD?
Almost 4 years.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So, Lauren, you have fair housing and equal opportunity.
Yes.
So I think most people have heard in general about the Fair Housing Act, but talk to us about that. What is that, and what does that mean for people?
Sure. The Fair Housing Act is one of the most important civil rights laws in the country. Another name for it is Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It's a law that prohibits discrimination in housing practices, in most housing transactions in the country. That law is enforced by my office, HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and also there's a lot of state and local government agencies that do similar things and have similar laws that they enforce.
What types of housing are covered by the Fair Housing Act?
It covers most housing transactions that take place. There are some exemptions that are set out in the Act. One example would be an owner-occupied building with no more than 4 units, single-family housing that's sold without a realtor or broker, or rented without a realtor or broker. Also housing that's operated by organizations or private clubs that limit membership to their own members. And you'd want to check the Act or check the HUD website to see whether you fall within one of these exemptions.
Okay, so who's protected from discrimination?
There's 7 protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act: race, color, national origin, gender, disability, and familial status, which means having children under 18 or being in the process of adopting a child under 18 or pursuing custody of one, or being pregnant. And did I say religion? Religion's also covered.
Okay.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so you mentioned protections for persons with disabilities. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So persons with disabilities are protected from being treated differently from other persons in housing, and also they have some additional rights under the Fair Housing Act, which would include the right to request a reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is an exception to a policy, practice, or procedure in housing that the person requires in order to have equal enjoyment of housing to a resident without a disability. There's also the right to a reasonable modification, which is a structural change, and that would be at the disabled person's expense, but they can request from their landlord the right to make a structural change to either their dwelling or maybe to a common area. And the landlord, under most circumstances, would have to allow them to do so, though they may require them to restore it to its original condition.
Okay, so the office that you work in
Yes.
handles the enforcement
Yes.
of the act. And how long have you been with HUD?
About 2.5 years.
Okay, and how do you handle enforcement? You get a complaint, you investigate it. What do you do?
We receive a complaint, and our intake branch screens those complaints for whether or not we have jurisdiction to investigate, because we can only enforce, these laws. And I'm an investigator. Once the case lands on my desk, I conduct a neutral investigation to see whether there's reasonable cause to believe the law was violated. So in that investigation, I will interview both parties, the complainant, the complaining party, and the respondent, the housing provider in most cases, and review documents, talk to witnesses, really whatever's needed to make the determination of whether there's evidence of discrimination.
So you mentioned 7
Yes.
7 areas that are protected, or 7 groups that are protected. Where do you see the majority of complaints?
Most of the complaints I've handled have either been disability or familial status. So I have handled, I think I've handled cases under all of these except for religion myself.
Okay, and if a complaint is found to be valid,
Yes.
what happens?
Then HUD would charge the case, and the case would either go to an administrative law judge or it would go to federal court. Either party can elect a federal court.
And how long from the time somebody makes a complaint, usually, would they hear a decision regarding their case?
It's our goal to finish every case in 100 days, but there are exceptions to that. Some cases we just can't get done in that amount of time.
Sure. So if somebody feels like they have been discriminated against, what can they do?
They can file a complaint with our intake branch at my office. You can file the complaint in several ways. There's www.hud.gov. There's a complaint form there where you can file it online. You can send HUD a letter and we'll review it and we'll call you if we have additional questions. You can call our office at 1-800-827-5005. And actually now there's also a discrimination app that you can access on your iPhone or an iPad.
Excellent, excellent, that's great.
I wanted to say that in addition to enforcement, which they do a fabulous job, that we also do a lot of training, because
Yes.
developers and owners want to be in compliance with the law. So we do a lot of outreach that way as well. So it's not just taking the complaints, there's that, it's a very important part of our work, but also working with those who are making investments and developing housing.
So the outreach piece of it,
Right.
what would that look like? You go into local communities, or where would you see that kind of training advertised?
I've done outreach in many contexts. Sometimes housing providers will contact us directly and request training, and if we can spare the staff to do it, we're happy to do that. Other times we've had settlements that required training actually as part of conciliation during a HUD investigation. So we'll provide training under that agreement. I've also provided outreach. We sometimes visit high schools just to make people aware of what the laws are, or there's a number of contexts where we can do that.
That's excellent, because money spent on the front end is always money well spent.
Also around doing regional plans, we had a recent new program, and they did an analysis of things that might come up as communities were doing planning. So it's, as you said, on the front end.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So Stephanie, you are the Community Planning and Development Office.
Right.
How long have you been with HUD?
I've been with HUD for about 8 years.
Okay, and talk a little bit more about what your office does.
So we administer the Community Development Block Grant Program, which goes to cities and states to do a variety of activities like infrastructure improvements, housing, supportive services. We also administer the home program, which is sort of a direct sort of affordable housing development program, and so that money just gets used to develop housing units, rental units, home ownership, housing for the homeless, and then we also administer the homeless programs.
Okay, that's a lot.
It is.
Barbara talked about the big four at the beginning. Where does your office fit size-wise?
So we're actually probably the smallest office, and the programs that we work directly with the states and the local entitlements, and through the homeless programs, we work with quite a few organizations, nonprofit organizations.
So you have lots of partners.
We do.
Okay. In terms of community block grant funding, which communities get that money? Who's eligible to get that money?
Well, that's based on a formula, and it's so it depends on the size of the of the entitlement. And if the formula determines that you would get less than $500,000 a year, then you would fall within the state's jurisdiction.
Formulas are always complicated, but is every community entitlement community?
No.
No. Okay. So in Massachusetts, for example, how many entitlement communities do we have? Is it a large percentage of the 350, plus communities? Would they be entitlement communities, or is it a pretty small percentage?
I would say it's probably about half of the communities, because there are a lot of smaller communities, and so it would be communities like Medford. The communities that I represent are Medford, Arlington, Revere, and so those would be the medium-sized communities, and of course Boston and Worcester are the larger entitlements, and then the state gets quite a large entitlement, and they're able to distribute it to the other communities.
So is your office is structured in such a way that you are actually sort of personally working with communities to assist them with their community block grant process?
That's right.
Okay.
So we are working with them. They will submit an annual plan to us, and that will sort of lay out what their goals are and how they, what their activities are to meet those goals. And so typically the goals would be, development of more affordable housing, improving the infrastructure, that type of thing, and then, they'll propose, specific activities within those goals, and so we will, and then they'll submit their planning, their review document, so that at the end of the year we can look at that and look at what they've done and what they've accomplished. And we also will do monitoring of those communities, so we go out and we look at what they've done and to determine that it's it was based on people, low-income people using those types of activities. So if it's if it's a park improvement, it would require that the park be in a low-income community, so that it's benefiting low-income people.
Okay. Now, you mentioned home funds. That's talk a little bit more about that program and where those monies go to and how that
Okay.
how that ultimately results in additional affordable housing.
Okay. So the home program is a program that was started in 1992, which was started to address the affordable housing crisis. And so the entitlements, so most of the entitlements can be, we'll get home funds. It really depends on the size. They do have to be a little larger. Because because if you're a CDBG entitlement, you might not necessarily be a home entitlement. However, you can be part of a home consortium. So I work with the Malden Consortium, and they, that includes Arlington, it includes Malden, Medford, Revere, and so those communities come together and sort of plan regionally to address the affordable housing crisis. And they will, the different consortiums do it differently. The Malden Consortium has monthly meetings, and they will accept projects from the different communities who've been working to, with the state, let's say, and they've gotten site control of a property where they want to develop, let's say, 12 units of veterans housing. Mm-hmm. And so they'll most likely, submit their proposal to the state for funding, to the home consortium for funding, and then, most likely to the local community for CDBG or something like that.
So these consortiums, a cluster of
Mm-hmm.
communities, who oversees them?
So the HUD, the Community Planning and Development Department oversees them, and each of the reps would have their different communities that they work with. So I work with the Malden Consortium, and and I also work with the City of Malden on their CDBG. So I work with the Arlington community on both their home funds and their CDBG. So I have that area.
Okay.
And the other reps, we have about I think about 11 reps in Boston, and they all work at various different locations.
In terms of the Community Block Grant Program and the Home Funds Program or the Home Program, in terms of their funding in recent years, has it been stable? Has it been cut back?
Well, it's been cut back, and depending on the formula and whether communities become more affluent or not, where their populations are increasing, whether it's low-income persons, it can change, it can stay the same, but in a lot of communities it's gone down in both the home program and the CDBG program.
That's been difficult here in Massachusetts because I believe that the Massachusetts communities use this money particularly well.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so my purview is to look at New England, and we know how to use this money because, as Stephanie says, the federal government sets out categories of use, and the communities, either through a consortium or if they're an entitlement community, get the money directly. They determine how they want to use it within the confines of our allowable uses. Mm-hmm. And all of these communities leverage additional money. So they'll go to another agency or they'll go to the private sector, to a bank, and they'll use that money. And I think we do a great job of using every dollar and making sure they maximize the others who are putting money in.
And I think that that's really an important message for our viewers to understand. Yeah. It's, the funding to address these critical areas, the problem of homelessness, the problem of affordable housing, it's not all coming from one source.
No,
there really are multiple partners involved in this effort.
Well, I think it's true public-private partnership. Right. I mean, we hear that a lot.
Right,
what does that really mean?
Right.
But the money that she's talking about, Stephanie, of the CPD dollars going in, those leverage private resources. And I think that's very important. We have the philanthropic community gets involved, our banking community, the mortgage brokers, they're all private sector partners.
Sure.
And our monies all have to work together. And even in public housing now, we are working to change some of the ways that we invest so they can also leverage additional private dollars, because we think it's all hands on deck.
Sure.
The affordable housing situation in this country is in such a way that we need to do that.
It is, okay. And sort of preparing for our conversation, or reading a little bit about the Continuum of Care program, talk about that.
Sure. Well, the Continuum of Care program was started in the 1990s, and it was a result of the increasing numbers of homelessness that that the communities were experiencing. And so the funding was, there was a lot of research done on where the funding could be most effective, and so the HUD structured the program in a way where the local communities would need to come together, and they would have to, do, quite a bit of planning around what they were going to use the funds for. So the shelters were experiencing, increasing numbers and not able to handle the homeless population. A lot of, there was a lot of families and individuals living on the streets. So what we looked at was, the feeling was that rather than increase the number of homeless shelters, we would increase the number of places for people to, depart from the homeless shelters. So we primarily at that point were funding transitional housing and permanent supported housing for the homeless. We also funded outreach because we were, working to get people off the streets. And so the continuum, the name the continuum really means a continuum of supports for the homeless, starting with street outreach to reach people on the streets. You've heard about a lot of families living in their cars. And then, working, to get people into shelter, stabilized, or at least off the streets. And, and that's where the backlog was. And so under the Continuum of Care program, the funding was specifically to go to transitional programs and permanent supported housing programs so that there would be that continuum of supports for people towards independence.
So this is obviously the issue of homelessness. Barbara, you said you've been with HUD for 3 years. Just in your time, where were we sort of 3 years ago? Where are we now?
Well, this is actually some good news to report. And so this administration, the president charged 19 different federal agencies to take on the issue of homelessness. And there is the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, and there are 4 agencies that sort of share the leadership. And this year, Sean Donovan, the Secretary of HUD, is in that leadership role. We do that together with the Veterans Administration, Department of Labor, and HHS, Health and Human Services, to say this is a priority. It's one part of the budget that has shown an increase. And because of the continuum of care and working and bringing service providers together with homeless, those who provide housing, we have actually seen a drop nationally in the number, and particularly focusing in on veterans, because no one in this country should put on the uniform and come home and not have a place to live. So we have targeted that, and as Charlie talked about earlier too, working together with the Veterans Administration, these particular vouchers, these type of Section 8 certificates have been targeted towards that population, and we have seen drops in the number of homeless, and we are rededicating ourselves to even go further by the end of 2015.
Yeah, I attended one of the interagency meetings that you presided over. I think it was probably about a year and a half ago, and just very impressed to see all of the different agencies there and all of the different partners. And at that particular meeting, you were taking on veterans homelessness, and that's an area where at least the metrics would show improvement.
Yes.
And just in terms of all of the different programs that we've talked about, obviously federally funded, taxpayer money. Our viewers like to know sort of what they're getting for their taxpayer dollars. Are there metrics that HUD has that we say, okay, this is what we did this year. These were our goals. We achieved this year. How do you talk about whether you're doing a good job or not?
We actually do have metrics. We have something within the agency called HUD Stat, it stands for statistics, and we actually have measurements in each department, and each of the people can talk about what their goals are, the number of cases they're looking at occupancy levels, right? We don't want to fund public housing and then not see the units filled.
Right.
And making sure that they're occupying safe and affordable, safe units and secure units. And then at the homeless particularly has probably been at the top of our measurement, and looking at how we can drop those numbers by connecting with the services. So that has taken HUD working with other agencies, but we within HUD are measuring ourselves on a whole host of those types of measures. So each department within HUD is absolutely looking at that.
So we've talked about, again, some of your partnerships. Who are the key federal agencies? What's going on out there in terms of federal collaboration?
Well, first of all, on the homeless issues, as I spoke about, we have our partnership with the VA, the Veterans Administration, and with HHS, because those are the types of things that people need. And I think Stephanie spoke quite well to the fact that once someone gets housed, they may still need services. And so making sure that continuum is there. Another very interesting partnership that HUD has been part of has been called the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. We've now worked for the last 5 years with the Department of Transportation and EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and we gave out some 145 planning grants around the country. We had 25 of them here in New England. And this was to say, where we put a transit stop, where we run a bus station, where is the housing? Can we create more walkability, which would really help people to lower their costs. Perhaps they can live with one car in a family or no car. Also get children riding their bicycle or walking to school. And so you have to think ahead where those investments are going. And I think here in New England, we've done a great job with these. We've had grants in Boston where there's some 4 new stops along the Fairmont corridor. That was DOT. But HUD has come in and said, what are we doing with the land there? Are we creating some affordable housing opportunities? And EPA has provided money to clean up some brownfield sites.
Wow.
So it really has been a partnership all along the way. We have another corridor that goes from Holyoke through Springfield into Hartford. So we've actually worked across state lines as well as getting communities. But I've had mayors say to me, you know, I knew the mayor in Springfield or Holyoke or Chicopee, but I never worked together with them. We were always competing for federal resources. Thank you for coming together and asking us to think in the long run, what will we be doing? Now at HUD, that program is called the Office of Economic Resilience, because while all the plans were different, because the needs are different in northern Maine than they are in Boston perhaps, everyone was talking about what can we do to have a more inclusive community, more economic opportunities for people, and how do we attract private investment, going back to what we were talking about earlier.
Right. You know, again, in preparation for today, obviously spending some time on the HUD website, you know, you log on to it and it just comes up, transforming HUD for the 21st century. I mean, some of these new ways of doing business and new ways of thinking and collaborations and all of these partnerships, but what are really the cornerstones of that transformation?
Well, I think we've touched on some of them. It is both an interagency collaboration, but internally, I think we have some of our different departments working together and shrinking the time that someone has to wait for a decision. If they apply for, in our housing division, if they apply for a loan guarantee on a multifamily development, we are measuring, again, you were asked how do we know we're performing. I see at quarterly meetings with the secretary, the different departments have to say, okay, it used to take 130 days, now we're down to 80 days, and are we moving towards our target goals? And I think also investing in our staff. I think around the table, I would all say that we are newer HUD employees, and so making sure that we bring in staff and provide training and opportunities. I know that Charlie did a rotation as part of his training with a state agency. So again, building that collaboration, not just in the federal government. He comes back to HUD after a few months bringing a knowledge of how the state works. And we can begin to think that our money has to work with the state money. It's good to know how they operate. So that's actually been one of the, I think, positive investments that we've made. And we've done that internally. Lauren worked in the legal department for a while, goes back to fair housing. You build bridges internally and externally. And I think that is part of how we need to work in the 21st century.
Excellent.
Out of our silos, thinking a little bit outside the box.
And all right, so we've certainly covered an awful lot of area. you know, and this would probably come out under the fourth program, big program that you talked about, just housing, and first-time home buyers. How does HUD help them? What programs does HUD offer for?
Well, we have the FHA program, the Federal Housing Administration, and usually provides a level of mortgage insurance. So we do that through companies that we have pre-qualified who can go out and do those loans. In addition, we have a tremendous commitment to home buyer counseling. So we fund agencies that provide counseling to people over 6 to 8 weeks or 6 to 8 sessions in which they learn what does it mean to buy a home, about budgeting, repairs, you know, putting away some money for those types of things that perhaps they didn't have to think about at all when they were renting, and then making sure they get the right mortgage product. I think that is the number one commitment of ours, to make sure that you get the product that works for your family, for your budget, and getting the right home.
So in terms of these agencies that HUD funds, where can somebody find one of them if they're, you know, thinking about buying their first home? What should they do?
Well, they can go to HUD.gov and we have a listing of them, or they can call our office and we can direct them to a housing counseling agency. They are throughout Massachusetts and throughout New England.
Okay. And so in terms of, I mean, we've talked about your partnerships with the private sector, we've talked about your partnerships with state and local government. When does HUD connect directly with the citizen? Is it through these phone calls where they call and ask a question about a different program?
Yes, I mean we do get phone calls, and you know, and anybody can call the office. Let's say, you know, sometimes it does get confusing out there. There's a lot of programs, there are a lot of people that do it, and sometimes it is just easier to call the HUD office, and we can, you know, if it's public housing, you know, we'll direct them to public housing. If it's home ownership, you know, they would be directed to us. If someone is interested in home ownership, or let's say someone's, you know, homeless, we get those calls too. We would, you know, ask where they are, where they're living, and direct them to that continuum of care. And so, you know, we would, you know, and then follow up to make sure that, you know, that they were, you know, connected to the right agency.
So you're a great resource for people. You're not necessarily going to have all of the answers, but you can usually get people
We can direct
on the
them.
right path.
That's right.
To where they need to be.
Yes.
I think as Charlie said also, they can call and find out where, we can tell them what the public housing authority is in their community. And you probably have the most direct contact with the public.
I would imagine. Yes, if you file a housing discrimination complaint with us, then we'll be working with you throughout the investigation to interview you, collect evidence from you, find out if there are any witnesses that we should speak with, but you'll have direct contact with an investigator throughout the investigation.
And so, you know, just going back to sort of your work, and of the complaints that you get, what percentage, again, are found to be valid?
I don't have those numbers on me right now. I'm sorry.
No, that's fair. That's fair. All right, so we've covered an awful lot of ground. What have we not shared with our viewers? I feel like we could have done a complete show on any one of these programs and just really sort of delve down. But what haven't we shared sort of in general terms about the work that HUD is doing here in Massachusetts, here in New England, across the country?
I would think one thing, because it was, I did not know about it when I came to HUD myself, so maybe your audience wouldn't know, is that one of HUD's mission is disaster recovery. So the immediate recovery is with FEMA, right? So immediate needs get met. But the long-term recovery is based at HUD, and we are working with many communities here in Massachusetts and throughout New England, obviously post-Sandy, post-Irene, for those situations where we make investments in helping work with communities on how to build more resilience as they rebuild lives. I know Springfield clearly with the tornado. We had Irene up in Vermont. As many of our communities impacted by Sandy. So those funds come through HUD, through Stephanie's division, the community development, and we are working with state government and with cities and towns in figuring out the best ways to reinvest in their communities after the immediate needs are dealt with FEMA. So you might not know that.
You know what? I did not know that.
I got another one for you too. I think a lot of viewers will be familiar with the term sequestration. Last year, there were some serious federal budget cuts. And one of the places that we got hardest hit was in the Section 8 program. But one of the things I'm really proud of in our office is that we worked closely with the different housing authorities who were facing these sudden shortfalls. They were worried they might have to terminate some people from the program. But we were able to work with them, come up with some creative funding solutions, ways to use different regulatory authorities, all different creative ways so that we actually didn't have to terminate anyone from the program last year.
Nice.
So people were able to stay in their housing despite this really difficult funding environment.
It was a tough time.
Hmm.
All right. Are we good?
Yeah. Well, thank
Excellent. Well, thank you
Yeah,
all.
thank you.
So that went quickly. I want to thank our guests for being with us today and for helping us to better understand the work of the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the impact of their work on individuals, families, and communities. I thank you for watching, and I hope that you will continue to join us as we feature other federal agencies on your federal government.